Okay, in this presentation, I want to go over how to measure variables. And this is kind of technical. We're going to talk about variables in a scholarly way. The slides are certainly oriented that way, but I do want to, relate it to more general things. And basically, what we're saying when I say measuring variables, part of it is identifying. A big part of this is going to also be about identifying variables. When we say something about the world, right? Is America great? Are we better off than we used to be? Is a country a democracy? These things are all relating to some underlying concept that we want to measure in the real world. We want to see what's longer or shorter, right? And so we're trying to get a abstract idea in our head and measure it in the real world. And so there's several steps in this. So let's talk about this. First of all, we say variable all the time, right? And it's technically any observable aspect of a phenomena that can vary from observation to observation. And okay, that's kind of a way of explicitly stating what's obvious. But very often, you got to put things into words, not just take the meaning as given. But a key thing about a variable is it has to vary. We have to see, something can't always be the same, or else it would be a constant. And we aren't too interested in constants because they don't change. And if we're trying to explain the world and therefore explain how things change, well, we need to say what's different now than it was before, or what's likely to happen differently in the future to produce a different outcome. So the variability of variables is actually kind of not trivial. Now, in the scholarly literature, we talk about dependent and independent variables. And again, part of this is, I want to introduce this language so it demystifies the scholarly stuff you have to read and opens the door to, understanding what the heck these guys are talking about, so you can do that. So I want to be careful. This is just a term that just is second nature to an academic in many disciplines, actually. And the dependent variable is the thing you're trying to explain. And this is very important when you're in not descriptive statistics, but when you're in explanatory things, when you're trying to say how things are related to things, when you're trying to find causal factors in the world. And so the dependent variable is the thing you're trying to explain. And, the researcher's always choosing this, right? The researcher, you want to explain how democracy occurs, right? If you're interested in studying democracy around the world and the reason you're interested in it is you're interested in it. You pick that. And it's important to point out that, when you study democracy, you can study democracy as the thing you're trying to explain, right? And therefore you're saying, well, where does it come from? What does it take to make a democracy, keep it going? Sometimes, though, democracy is not the dependent variable. Sometimes it's what in the next slide we're going to see is the independent variable, the thing that causes other things. Do democracies go to war with one another? And we have this democratic peace idea, and we find they typically don't. Therefore, democracy causes nations not to fight other nations that are also democracies. Or does democracy create economic growth? Does democracy make people happy? I mean, there's a lot of ways in which you might be trying to explain something else, war, economic growth, whether people are happy, using democracy as the independent variable. And the other things, the thing you're trying to explain is the dependent variable. So it's always important to know what your dependent variable is. Sometimes people will talk about the world and it's a mush. One thing causes another, and they're never really getting down to, well, this is the particular thing I'm trying to explain. So you always want to keep that. That's why the last line here is know your dependent variable. Whenever you're doing something, know what it is you're trying to explain, and keep that in mind. And like I said, by the way, we call it the way to. I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to remember which the dependent. They're not as clear in some ways. I would say the dependent variable is called the dependent variable because its value is hypothesized to depend on the value of other variables, right? And so, how much democracy is there? It depends on these other things, which are your explanatory variables. Okay, let's talk about those explanatory variables. Typically, in statistical or empirical work, we talk about the independent variables, and they're always labeled X, and when they're graphed, they're always on the X-axis. And that's why X and Y. And you will see, by the way, a lot of times in statistical heavy research, they'll have a little formula, Y equals something or other, BX1, BX2, because you have more than one independent variable. So that's why I have the X and the Y here. Independent variables are explanatory variables, and although we use the term explanatory variable more when we're talking theoretically, when you get down to testing things and doing statistics, it always becomes the independent variable. Because very often your variable is an indicator, right? Not the actual thing. So that's why the words change a little bit. But sometimes it's helpful to just think of these as explanatory variables. Or, although we really don't like this term, cause and effect. These are the causes, the dependent variables are the effects. In general, the independent variables are things that are thought to affect the dependent variable, to affect its value. You don't come up with these things out of nowhere, right? Usually, the independent variables are identified through either qualitative research, empirical research, or more often than not through theoretical research, where people think, why is this happening, right? Why do we see a candidate winning an election? What do we think is going on? What do we think voters are thinking? And therefore, if we want to explain why someone wins an election, we go in, if we a lot of times you study individual voters, you may be, and this is a unit of analysis question, we may not be discussing the election. We might be saying, well, what's the vote, right? What makes somebody vote for somebody? Two different ways of approaching the question. But the idea is that there will be some theoretical work. They'll say, well, voters are driven by their economic well-being. And so voters who are doing well off will vote for the incumbent. Voters that are not doing well off will vote for the challenger. And that's one way of, again, I mentioned earlier, we're always interested in generalization. So it's, incumbent versus challenger allows us to identify, hey, there's the person who's in power gets blamed or credited. And the challenger is in, the position of offering an alternative. And is doing the blaming or trying to deny credit. So that's one way to kind of generalize things. But the point is that you'll think about it. And another way of thinking, there'll be other ideas out there. Well, maybe voters don't just vote off of their own economic well-being. Maybe they look at the way the nation is going and they vote off of if the economy is doing well. So maybe they're doing fine, but if the economy is not doing well, they're worried and they blame the incumbent. And that's by the way, distinctly different theoretical explanation for a vote. And that will lead you to a different independent variable rather than, a question about how the voter's been doing. You might use data on, how the economy in general is doing. The point is, there's some reason to think that this variable affects the dependent variable. And that's what theory, that's all theory is. Theory is a bunch of ideas about cause and effect in the world, how one thing affects another one. And this is generally where we come up with the independent variables. And when you have when you identify a set of independent variables that you think explains the value of the dependent variable, or you expect to be related to it in some way, that's called a model. right? And we talk a lot about having empirical models to try and predict the value of the dependent variable, to say, well, hey, if we have, these 5 things, they should explain what we're interested in. Now, I have this thing, causality. I mentioned causality. We're interested in that. In statistics, we don't find causality. Statistics identifies correlations, patterns in the observed world. We're not sure. If there is a causal relationship between X and Y, then we should see a correlation of some kind in the world. But not every correlation is going to be causal. Right? And so that's an important thing to always keep in mind, that if you want to argue that something's causal, very often you have to establish it. And usually the idea is you have to have a good theoretical explanation of why X causes Y. And then when you have that predicts a correlation. You go into the world, look at the data, you see the correlation. Now you have some confidence in the theory, but the original theory is very important in establishing causality, which is something that's a very big part of the scientific method. So again, something to keep in mind. Okay, so that's where you're trying to get. You're trying to get in your research to having concrete measures of X and Y, or maybe 5 X's and a Y to explain 1 Y, because we like to have multiple. We don't like things aren't caused. We don't think that things are caused by one particular thing. The world isn't that simple. So that's why you build multi-variable models. But before you can get to those, you have to take. You have to start in the world of ideas. As I just mentioned, you have to say you have some explanation, some idea of how you think the world works. This is your theoretical model of the world. And you have concepts. So you're starting in a realm of concepts. And you have to move to having concrete indicators, things that can be measured reliably, and you've got to take an abstract concept and concretize it to a point where it can be measured. And this is a big part. And so I say when you're measuring a variable, we have 3 steps overall. One, you start out with a step of definition. What do you mean by this? Right? Purely conceptual. What do you mean by democracy? What does it mean that America is great? What is social justice? What is, what is economic development? What is human well-being, right? What are these things? What do we really mean by these various things? We start out, we have to, define what we're talking about. And so we start out for each variable at a level of defining it. That's purely conceptual. Then we go through a process of operationalization, which takes this concept, this idea, and kind of works on it conceptually and finds a way of saying what it would look like in the world, and then identifying indicators that will measure its presence in the world. And we have to. So we're going from abstract to concrete. From ideas to indicators. And that's a very important process of measuring the variable. And then once we've got that, we have some quantitative methods for doing that and issues involved in, what is the measure? And so these are things to consider that are kind of technical aspects of those measures of the concrete indicator you end up with in the operationalization process. Okay, defining, academics saying we haggle over definitions a lot. And it's important, but, I understand it is sometimes vexing to people. The process of defining a variable is simply assigning a word or phrase to an aspect of reality. And an important thing to consider in this, you might not think it to begin with, but does that aspect of reality exist prior to the definition? Are we, is there really something out there? Now, a lot of times things, are obviously, exist. People exist, and, countries exist, and there's a lot of things out there that we measure that, well, duh. But there are other things out there. Do human rights exist before we define them? And so there's a lot of, especially when we talk about these social facts, a lot of them we ask, well, are they really there? If you think there's a wave of democratization running through the world at any given point, and there is some researchers who've talked about waves of democratization, is there really such a thing? Or are you creating a concept, or are you imagining something? So we always want to, be careful to keep that in mind, that, is there really some aspect of reality that we can, that we're really latching onto? And usually the way you do that, the way you feel that you're pretty sure is when people talk about something a lot, when they talk about identity. Does identity exist, right? This is a big thing, identity politics. Do people have identity? And well, psychologists have talked about it, and but does it really show up if we're trying to explain voters? Is identity really something there? And you look at the world and you say, well, are people talking about this? Are they talking about themselves? Or do we see things that indicate that yeah, there is some, that people are referencing their identities, they're doing things that suggest it's important. So maybe in this research, focusing on voters and how they feel about their identity would be worthwhile. That's always kind of a, when you're thinking of your research and looking for it, that's something to keep in mind. So another thing I think is important, and I'm giving a lot of cautions here, rather than explaining exactly what defining a variable is besides that first line. Definition is not explanation. When you define something, you have not necessarily explained anything. And you will find sometimes in trade journals and things that people will come up with a concept, and they will, talk about it, and they will say, okay, this is, I remember when I was in the Army, they had some guy talking about the lexicon of low intensity conflict, and he spent all the time explaining what he meant by lexicon and what it was, and it just, he kind of just seemed like once you had this idea in your head, it would be, wonderful. And I kept saying, well, there's an idea here. You've identified this type of conflict, and you've categorized things, but you haven't really explained anything. You haven't told me, well, how do you win the damn thing? You haven't really explained anything. And so you have to be careful. A lot of times people will define stuff and then, not go that extra step. In general, when you have a definition, you have to take them on their own terms. And they come out of the theoretical world of thinking about the world. People say, all right, I think this is important. I think identity is driving a lot of voters, so we are going to define the concept of identity and try to measure it in voters to see if it's actually affecting their votes in the way, or their attitudes, or their intention to vote in the way we expect it to. And all of this is going to come out of some theoretical research, and the researcher is going to have to define the idea. And the word that gets applied generally has to be taken on their own. Words are not authoritative, and so if someone wants to define identity in a particular way, while there are standard definitions, and you tend to gravitate towards those, and good researchers tend to use those, you always have to be careful, because a person can tweak it, and they can latch on to a particular form of it, or maybe a dimension of an overall concept. For the word globalization, talk about a concept. There are a lot of different meanings of globalization out there. People use the word all the time. Sometimes it means economic development. Sometimes it means integration of markets. Sometimes it means power, foreign influence on a nation. There's a whole bunch of different meanings that can be attached to the word globalization. And so you always have to, have people when an author's using it and when they're conducting research on it, you need to take them at their word, and therefore their word, they have to be clear about what they mean, right? A bad thing for a definition to be is ambiguous, right? If you're not very clear of what you mean, that's a problem. I can't take you at your word if I don't have your word. Also, is that definition applied consistently, right? Inconsistent use of the term can destroy an empirical work, right? If you start out describing globalization as the integration of international markets, which means you have to show that prices in countries are converging, right? The idea there's one price for oil all around the world, that's an integrated market, a globally integrated market. Well, if you define it, globalization, that way, and then start doing research and your data is all about how much foreign influence there is in a country, right? The percentage of the country's economy that's involved in trade, say. Well, that's different, and so you're being inconsistent and you're kind of undercutting everything. So we're looking for, explicit definitions, and that they be consistently applied. Those are the things we can criticize. But otherwise, you have to, the definitions are usually not wrong. It could be that you define globalization in a way that's not interesting to other people. You might be totally uninterested in market integration when you think of globalization. I'm freaking fascinated by it, but it's not wrong. Right? It may be narrower than you like, but it's a self-defined thing. Okay, operationalization. The process of operationalization is boggy. Now, Pollock gives a little formula for it. So, the textbook has a way to talk about it. Let me just give you my take on it. We're really talking about a process where and it's largely conceptual, where you start with the definition. You start with some idea in your head, globalization, right? And you've got it in your head, and you have a meaning in mind. You have to go from, and when it's in your head, it's abstract. It's not in the world, right? So it's an abstract concept, and you got to get to a concrete variable. Well, I like to think of it as you go through this process of, you have the idea, you then think about the idea and flesh out a more meaningful definition, right? So what do you mean by it? When you think of globalization, what do you mean by it? And so you have to talk, you have to write a couple paragraphs down, and you have to say, this is exactly what I'm thinking. And so you have to develop a more meaningful definition. The kind of thing that drives a lot of people crazy, because it's very academic-y. But you've got to go through this process of, well, what do we mean by globalization? And by the way, when I think about globalization, I say, well, I hear globalization. Like, there's another word out there, internationalization. And we used to talk about international trade and before the G word started getting floated around. And if the G word, globalization, or global, means anything, if all that G-ness means anything, as opposed to the typical I-ness of international and internationalization, what's the difference? And, I think in terms of, well, international can be one nation to another. If I buy something from one nation and ship it to another, that's just international. And, the rest of the world be damned. What's global is when everyone's involved, right? And so when my purchase of a product in France is somehow affected by what goes on in Nigeria, hey, that's global. Or, when we're really getting into that. And that's why I'm a big fan of the idea of integrated markets, where a good example to my mind, the perfect one, is the oil prices. My purchase of oil in the United States, and increasingly we produce, and we don't import nearly as much oil as we used to. We're fracking, and that's not a sci-fi swear. We're fracking and producing a lot of oil, and so there's oil being purchased, being produced, refined, and consumed in the United States. But the price of oil is driven by decisions that are made, and how around the world. How much oil, if China's economy is doing well, they import a lot of oil, that pushes the price of oil up. Saudi Arabia and Russia, they decide how much they're going to produce, and their decisions on production affect the price. And in fact, that's been, this is really why prices are low. Chinese aren't importing much. They're not demanding much. The Saudi Arabia and Russia have not cut their production. And the combination of these effects has driven the price of oil pulled out of Texas down. To my mind, that's global, right? That's the world affecting things. So, see what I'm saying? I've talked about it a bit, and I've got some concept. I've gone to a more meaningful definition. So things global are related to wide-ranging effects of international actors, of other actors on economic decisions, right? And so this is where I'm starting to move in a direction. So I end up saying, all right, so really what I'm interested in is the integration of markets, right? Basically I bring this idea of integration in. I think that's a good word to throw in to explain it. And so I'm going to look for evidence of, if I want to measure globalization, I'm going to look for evidence suggesting that integration goes on, and I'm going to look for things like maybe geographic concentration of industries. If all the aircraft in the world are produced in one place and everyone's buying them, that's interesting. That's kind of converging. But more importantly, I can look for the convergence of prices. And the more meaningful definition drives me towards specific indicators, right? And so that's hopefully talking through that. And I still don't have a really good definition. Globalization is a slippery one, but that's what I'm talking about. You have to go through this more meaningful definition process. At the end of the day, though, we're going to have two issues as we go through this process. We got reliability and validity, and I know that this has been discussed before, but let's double down on it a bit. Reliability is the precision of a measurement. Can two people code a variable the same way, right? And so if you get an indicator, and generally an indicator is a phenomena which in and of itself can be reliably measured, right? When you're talking in terms of indicators, if I say, well, I want to see I want to look at the price of crude oil in different nations and see how much it varies, right? So let me look at the variation, of crude oil prices in various nations to see how much they've converged towards one another. That is, we're only going to call it an indicator if I have defined it in a way that, and I probably have to explain that a little bit more in detail. Where's that data going to come from, and exactly how am I going to measure variance? Although variance is actually a technical statistical term. And the point, though, is once I write the sentence or two or the paragraph down of how I'm measuring it, pretty much anybody who reads that and understands statistics will be able to go out, get the same, given the same data, they'll come up with the same answer. And that is the, concrete, right? That is what we're trying to get to, a reliable indicator. And the problem is that really measuring the original concept, right? The variance of crude oil prices around the world. Is that really measuring the integration of markets around the world? And, you know, that's the big question that is posed by validity. And we can think of validity as the accuracy of a measurement, right? Does the indicator actually measure the concept? And, your abstract concept is very high in validity. It's, when it's in your head, it's perfect because that's the starting point. And as you move out into the world and try to explain it more and then try to measure it, very often it's not necessarily the case, but I like to say that there's this tension between validity and reliability. The pure abstract concept is 100% valid. And then as you start trying to explain it, your use of words gets in the way. Maybe it loses a little of your original meaning and what you're looking for. But then when you start trying to find concrete things in the world to measure it, you might very well lose more and more of the validity. And so, precision and accuracy. By the way, for military people, a way that it's usually explained is when you shoot a rifle, you have a shot group, the size of your shot group. How dispersed is it? And a rifle that if someone constantly shoots high into the left of the target, but they have a very tight shot group, they're precise because they're always hitting the same place, but they're not accurate. They're not on target, right? Whereas somebody who has a big dispersed shot group, bullets are 6 inches apart from each other on the target, but it's center mass of of the bullseye. That's accurate, right? Because they are on target. They're just not very precise. The shot group's not tight, right? And so, the perfect measure or the perfect shot is a tight shot group on the target. That's one way to think of precision versus accuracy that sometimes helps people. But in general, though, I really think, you're always fighting the battle of getting a reliable indicator that is still valid. Okay, now there's types of data, and the books cover this ad nauseum. We have nominal data, ordinal data, interval data. There's also something called ratio data. Nominal data is stuff that's coded by name. It doesn't have a value, and the classic one is gender, right? You're male, you're female. You can also, other obvious ones are what country someone's from. Are you an American? Are you German? Right? That's nominal because there's no, and the key thing here is it's the name. The only difference is the name. We don't have a sense of scale or size attached to this. And that's going to be important. We can't rank order things. We can just say different, right? Each category is different. And these things come up a lot, when we talk about great wars versus less wars, now there may be a size scale in there, but if we're thinking of a categorization, right, different categories, it's the name. Now, the next type of data is ordinal. These are categories that, and we often think, when you have a variable, you often break it into categories. Now, sometimes, especially with nominal, they're always going to be categories. And sometimes we call nominal and ordinal data, both of these, categorical data, meaning that they're distinct categories, as opposed to, as we're going to see with interval, a number, right? You can have $1.50, can't have 1.5 people or 1.5 countries, or so there's that idea of having the opposite of a discrete or categorical variable is a continuous variable. Something can be subdivided, if you will. The values can be subdivided. So there aren't a small number of categories where the values are going to fall. Ordinal is, the way to remember this is order, right? It's basically a categorical variable where the categories are inherently ordered in some way. Small, medium, large. There you go. Small, medium, large. I know that the medium is larger than the small, and that the large is bigger than the medium and the small. So there's a distinct order there. How the difference is, how much of a difference there is, a little vague on that, right? And so we have ordering when we talk about classes, like middle class, lower class. By the way, letter grades, A, B, C, are ordinal, right? Interval level data is generally numbers. But the key thing is the data is coded in such a way that the difference in two codings reflect the difference in the level of the variable. So instead of small, medium, large, I might have 8 ounce, 12 ounce, 16 ounce. Right? So I might measure the size of something in terms of the ounces, like because it's cups of soda. And the word interval, what's the difference between a 12 ounce and a 16 ounce? 4 ounces. The interval between the coding, the number associated with it, and coding always means, how do I code a variable? Sex. How is sex coded? Male, female, right? Those are increasing, we may have to have other categories there too. But how you code, and that's an interesting thing. The coding choices we make in the world for that variable. It's the names we attach to different values. And with interval, usually the code is a number, and the difference in the number is meaningful. Difference between 12 and 16 ounces is 4 ounces. And yeah, that's meaningful. There's 4 ounces more in there. With ordinal data, to go back to it, small, medium, large. There's the difference in the code. What's the difference between small and medium? I don't know. Even if we assign numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and frequently in surveys, classic ordinal thing is a survey response. Do you agree? Do you strongly agree? Agree? Disagree? Strongly disagree? Those are 4 ordinal categories. They're ordered. And we might have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's how we code it. We, give 1 for strongly agree, 2 for, and this is how we keep the data in our data set, by putting numbers down, and we have a key that tells us what a 1 means, what a 2 means. But the difference between a 1 and a 2 is meaningless, or 1 and a 3. Yeah, the difference is 2, but they're just orders in a category, right? So what's the difference between first and fifth place? It's 4 places, but what's the difference in, if we're looking at a race, and, the time? What's the time difference between the first place and the 4th place? That time difference, that interval, is meaningful. The interval between first and 4th, just tells you there's 4 people in there. By the way, I mentioned there's something called ratio. Ratio level data is data that if you divide one value by another, it's meaningful. And, if is 24 ounces, if I'm measuring ounces in a cup, is 24 ounces, if I got a 12 and a 24, 24 divided by 12 is 2. Okay, that's the ratio. Does that reflect reality? Well, there's twice as much stuff in a 24 ounce cup as there is in a 12 ounce cup. All right, meaningful. One really good, there are a lot of examples of interval level data that isn't ratio, but the classic one is dates, right? If somebody's born in 1974 and somebody else is born in 1984, well, the interval is 10 years. And is that meaningful? Yeah. There's 10 years of difference in that age. If I divide birth dates, it's totally meaningless. The other, by the way, there's an arbitrary 0. And so, you don't have twice as many years. Birth dates are interval level data, not ratio. By the way, temperatures, because 0 is an arbitrary thing, temperatures are also, yes, the difference between 2 temperatures is an interval, but if the it's not twice. If I have one day is 40 degrees and another day is 80 degrees, it's not twice as hot on the 80 degree day, it's just 40 degrees warmer Fahrenheit on that day. All right, just so you know. The key thing about types of data is with certain types of data, when we talk about doing statistical operations on it, nominal level data, you can do less statistically with it than you can ordinal or interval. And so the measures of central tendency and the statistical methods you use are this is very important stuff for statisticians. For the rest of the time. Finally, something to keep in mind is there can be multivariable measures out there. And some of these are really awesome. And, you can have indexes or scales. And these are basically things that take multiple measures of the phenomena you're interested in and bring them together to give you kind of a one measure of something. For instance, the Dow Jones Index. This is a bundle of stocks that people have decided that when we look at, if we take the price of all these stocks and add them up, the total value of this bundle of Microsoft, and I don't even know what they are. There's a lot of them in there. These things are an indicator of the overall performance of the stock market. Right? These are the big, reliable stocks, and so we think this is a measure of how things are going generally. Right? That's the thing about an index. It's a composite measure put together by somebody. Right? And Dow Jones, it's the Dow Jones people that put the original basket of stocks together and said, we want this one and that one and the other. And over time, they have, when they think that, well, maybe railroad stocks aren't indicative of the economy anymore, and maybe these big blue, these old, U.S. Steel and all these other things are not important. Maybe we should be adding things like Microsoft and Apple and Google into the mix, and Facebook. These other, they decide what's in and out of the basket, and it's a judgment call as what the stocks they think that represent the overall U.S. economy. And that, by the way, is all there is to it, and that is one of the problems with them is it's a judgment call. That's why there are many different indexes out there. But we get a lot of them. We get, there's indexes for corruption of nations. There's indexes, really interesting ones to measure the level of democracy in a country. There's just all sorts of indexes that people put together out there. The Human Development Index that the UN does to try and say, well, how people are doing in a country. We have a lot of them out there that provide a multi-level measure of the phenomena, because sometimes one indicator just doesn't cut the mustard. There also, sometimes something is a scale. That's when you take a bunch of measures, you bring them together, but then you systematically derive the data from them, and you work on them in some way that makes the number less of a judgment call. A scale involves some kind of statistical test to make sure that the numbers are right that are in there, and gives a reading off of them. And there are different types, but the key thing to keep in mind between a scale and an index is a judgment call of a bunch of things to put together to come up with a number. A scale, sort of judgment call with an assist from statistics in some way to clear out, measures that are coordinated and whether or not they actually are measuring the same phenomena. So there's a little bit more statistics involved in those. Okay, so this has been just kind of a basic overview of some concepts involved in measuring things. Hopefully this gives you a little bit, the books go into the details of a lot of this stuff in far greater depth. But hopefully this gives you an idea of where these things fit in and why we're talking about them.